conversation with my 9-year-old son. I will tell you for sure that he was not born on the spectrum of autism. He was engaging, he was responding, he was meeting his milestones until the 16-month to 18-month round of that MMR big dose of vaccines. In a negative way, we're trained not to ask questions, not to be litigators for our children. That's what I do for a living. I fight for people. I'm a legal bodyguard. And I had to deal with this for years, that I was not a good lawyer for my son. Every lawyer in America should be going absolutely apeshit over this issue. Think about what I'm going to tell you. No double-blind placebo study, meaning no safety studies. A crap load of injuries, no accountability. What lawyer would be okay with that? Even if you don't believe the claim that vaccines could be causing these injuries to our children, you can't be happy with that system. You can't. You know, I'm the one that looks at my son, and I can see him when he's having his meltdowns. I can see him trapped in the prison of autism. I can see him screaming and yelling at me and saying Pop, how do I get out of here? What do I do to get out of here? I didn't do anything to get in here. Can you help me get out of here? I'm the one, we're the one that has to deal with that. And the one thing I will not tell my son is that I'm too much of a chicken shit to tell your story. That I promise you.
If you are going to tell me that at the age of 2 years old, I am having these conversations with my child, and if I had walked in to a pediatrician and you gave him a shot, and suddenly he was no longer able to communicate with me, he was no longer able to walk in the same capacity for the rest of his life. I mean, even saying this in the air makes me so angry to even picture this happening, right? For the rest of his life, he was never going to be able to lead an independent life. Only for a doctor and the medical establishment to look at me, smug in the face, and tell me that I don't know what the hell I am talking about, right? That this is just how my child was born. It was going to happen inevitably. It had nothing to do with what they injected into him that day. I would probably turn into a dragon. That's what I think I would do. I think I would turn into a dragon, and I would be standing on buildings trying to burn the entire medical establishment down. How dare these people develop the audacity to look parents in the face and to gaslight them this extreme, to try to hang the entire hat of millions of people that have come out and said that their children are having reactions, to hang it on one man in an article. Oh, yeah, these parents are just confused. They don't know their own children. How could they possibly know their own children? What are you saying to parents? And I know you guys are having an emotional response to what I'm saying because you are raising children. You know how well you know your children. You don't need to wait for them to be 2 and 3 to develop their personalities. Those personalities start showing right away.
Before the vaccines, there was a high mortality earlier last century, but the mortality of measles plummeted before the vaccine was ever introduced. So it's not like a particularly deadly disease, although yes, you can have some deaths, but I don't want to be dismissive, but there's many different ways that we have deaths. I mean, there's bicycle accidents, there's motor vehicle accidents. And again, I think this outsized obsession and then this drumming of the need for vaccination. And then the MMR, are you kidding me? That's how you vaccinate. MMR is a dangerous vaccine, in my opinion. Japan stopped MMR vaccines in 1993.
Wow.
There's got to be a reason for that, right? At least someone's paying attention to the science. And so I find this measles stuff, just like with the bird flu, it's really unfortunate. The only answer is vaccine, right? It's one size fits all. Everyone needs to get vaccinated, and then they scare you into. Then people, I think, get nervous, right? Or they'll feel guilty. I didn't vaccinate my child, and somehow they feel like they're going to have a role. And again, I think that it's all unfortunate.
Yes. Can you walk us through just a layperson's cost-benefit analysis with an MMR vaccine versus a child getting measles themselves and treating it with a vitamin A? Because I think that's really, if I were to advocate for parents to kind of do their own research and go out and try to make this decision, because at this point now we have members of the medical freedom community coming out and saying it's time to get your MMR vaccine or recommending it. You consider it a dangerous drug. What should parents know about MMR and the potential for adverse impact or an adverse reaction?
Well, MMR vaccines, in my opinion, have definitively been associated with autism. I mean, if you look at Andy Wakefield's work and how his career got ended for bringing that information out to the public, making that association, and then we're dealt with a deluge of literally what I would call propaganda in these journals. Shanna, you're well aware of the censorship that is occurring at the level of the medical journals. You saw that in COVID.
Yeah.
That's been going on with vaccines for decades. I mean, they don't publish inconvenient science around vaccines. And those of us who know the literature, and you look at maybe the second and third tier journals, you can find immense amount of evidence of the dangers of these. And so, I know just myself personally, well, now that I'm as part of the medical freedom moment, I know families, I have friends whose kids are like literally totally dependent on their parents and near institutionalized, from just the most severe forms of autism, which occurred after the MMR vaccine. And so the risk benefit for me, for something that has a reasonably low mortality, especially for a healthy child who, takes vitamin D or vitamin A, it's not very high. Case fatality rates in high income settings is like 0.1%.
Yeah.
Low income populations, it's a little higher, but 0.1% is not a deadly illness. I mean, many of us or former generations, they routinely had measles. It wasn't a problem. So I again, and then remember, you asked me, Shannon, about risks and benefits, and I was trying to introduce. Whenever you have a risk and benefit conversation, you always have to do risks, benefits, and alternatives, right? And so, which is treatment, making sure that you're up to date on your vitamins and all that. And that's the way I would go. Vaccines, we're learning more and more. They don't do what they're supposed to. They fail a lot, and they come with a lot of toxicity.
Although small outbreaks happen, measles are rare in the U.S., with fewer than 1,200 cases occurring since 2020. Since 2015, there have only been 4 measles-related deaths in the U.S. The first death was in 2015 when a 20-year-old woman experienced several complications and comorbidities due to the immune-suppressing drugs. She died of pneumonia. The second was on February 26, 2025, when a child who was almost completely recovered from measles went to the hospital emergency room. She was diagnosed with community-acquired pneumonia. In the hospital, she was given an inappropriate antibiotic against the standard of care for the type of pneumonia she had, and her condition continued to deteriorate. She was admitted to the ICU and was finally correctly diagnosed. The hospital waited 10 hours before administering the correct antibiotics for her strain of pneumonia, but it was too late and the child passed away the next day. She died due to a hospital error and not measles. The third person died on March 6, 2025 at home. The individual was only diagnosed with measles when the autopsy was performed. This death is still under investigation and the cause of death has not yet been determined. The fourth person died on April 4, 2025 at University Medical Center in Lubbock, Texas. The death is under investigation and the cause have been 106 deaths caused by the MMR or MMRV vaccine reported to VAERS, which is the CDC's Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. Again, MMRV is another MMR vaccine with the varicella component that's added, and we'll discuss that vaccine in a later episode. When we talk about VAERS, it's important to keep in mind that VAERS may only be capturing 1 to 10% of all vaccine adverse events. That is a tiny percentage of the actual adverse events that people are really experiencing. Priorix and other MMR vaccines are also associated with numerous serious adverse events, chronic illnesses, and death in infants and children. In Section 13.1, the packaging insert states that Priorix has not been evaluated for carcinogenic or mutagenic potential or impairment of fertility. So we don't know if the vaccine can cause cancer, if it causes genetic mutations, or if it impacts fertility in our children.
Let me explain to you why some people oppose the MMR vaccine. In every single dose of an MMR shot, there are literally millions of pieces from the cultured cell line of an aborted fetus in every single injection. Now, again, that might sound crazy, but I could literally pull up right now the CDC's own ingredient list for the MMR vaccine. Anybody can do this at home. Just Google MMR vaccine excipient list, CDC, and you can pull it up and you can see it has MRC5, WI38. Those are cultured cell lines from aborted fetus, because you have to grow viruses in a cell. Viruses won't just grow. They have to grow in cells. That's how they replicate. They take over the machinery of a cell. So you have to grow it on a cellular substrate. So how do they grow the rubella virus? They grow it on these cultured cell lines from aborted fetus.
Where do they get aborted fetuses?
From babies that are aborted.
From abortion clinics.
It has to be. You can't use. So the cells need to be alive. Okay, so you understand, like, the aborted fetal tissue has to remain alive to be used. And so, I deposed, for example, the world's leading vaccinologist, Dr. Stanley Plotkin, and that deposition is actually available on thehighwire.com. The whole deposition, 9 hours, is available there. Okay.
Parts of it are available on X, and
yes,
I watched part of it in preparation for this interview, and was, so shocked and revolted by it. I was already on your side, obviously, as a parent of a child who was vaccine injured. So I'm in tune with everything you're saying. But that deposition with Dr. Stanley Plotkin, who's still alive, 93, I checked, was one of the most shocking things I've ever seen in my life.
You watched the whole thing?
No, I watched selections of it. Okay,
yeah. And so then about what the clip I'm about to talk about, which is relating to just one study that was done that involved over 70 normal, healthy fetuses, right? There was nothing wrong, no abnormalities, that were aborted for the purposes of this one study. I mean,
past the first trimester, but they're all older than 3 months, he said.
That's right. And some of them, absolutely. And what they do is they take those, in that one study, those 70-something babies, and they they chop them up into little each body part. So they take the tongue, the lung, the liver, every body part, and they chop them up into little cubes, and then they try to culture viruses on them, because they want to see which part of the body is the best suited for growing the virus used in the vaccine. And so this is, in any event, and there's a lot, anybody who wants can research about this.
So this is answering the question, why is this a religion for some people? There's some heavy stuff going on.
You mean
For years now, parents have wondered if vaccines are linked to conditions like autism and ADD. Government officials and some scientists say there is no connection, and they're often backed by independent experts. But just how independent are they? You may be surprised at what Cheryl Atkinson found when she set out to follow the money. They're some of the most trusted voices in the defense of vaccine safety. The American Academy of Pediatrics, Every Child by Two, and pediatrician Dr. Paul Offit. But CBS News has found these three have something more in common. Polio number 2. Strong financial ties to the industry whose products they promote and defend. The vaccine industry gives millions to the Academy of Pediatrics for conferences, grants, medical education classes, even help pay to build their headquarters. The totals are kept secret, but public documents reveal bits and pieces. $342,000 was given to the Academy by Wyeth, maker of the pneumococcal vaccine, for a community grant program. $433,000 was contributed to the Academy by Merck, the same year the Academy endorsed Merck's HPV vaccine. Another top donor, Sanofi Aventis, maker of 17 vaccines, and a new 5-in-1 combo shot just added to the childhood vaccine schedule last month. Every Child by Two, a group that promotes early immunization for all children, admits the group takes money from the vaccine industry too, but wouldn't tell us how much. A spokesman told us there are simply no conflicts to be unearthed. But guess who has been listed as the group's treasurers? An official from Wyeth and a paid advisor to big pharmaceutical clients. Then there's Dr. Paul Offit, perhaps the most widely quoted defender of vaccine safety. He's gone so far as to say babies can theoretically tolerate, quote, 10,000 vaccines at once. This is how Offit described himself in a previous interview.
I'm the chief of infectious diseases at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and a professor of pediatrics at Penn's Medical School.
Dr. Offit was not willing to be interviewed on this subject, but like others in our investigation, he has strong industry ties. In fact, he's a vaccine industry insider. Dr. Offit holds a $1.5 million research chair at Children's Hospital funded by Merck. He holds the patent on an anti-diarrhea vaccine he developed with Merck, Rototec, which has prevented thousands of hospitalizations in the U.S. And future royalties for the vaccine were just sold for $182 million cash. Dr. Offit's share of vaccine profits, unknown. There's nothing illegal about the possible conflicts of interest, but as one member of Congress put it, money from the pharmaceutical industry can shape the practices of those who hold themselves out to be independent. The American Academy of Pediatrics, Every Child by Two, and Dr. Offit wouldn't agree to interviews, but all told us they're upfront about the money they receive, and it doesn't sway their opinions. Today's immunization schedule now calls for kids to get 55 doses of vaccines by age 6. Ideally, it makes for a healthier society, but critics worry that industry ties could impact the advice given to the public about all those vaccines.
It's making headlines around the world. The highly contagious measles virus is seeing a resurgence.
Health leaders at both the local and national level are warning of a recent uptick in what they consider to be a preventable disease.
There's a new health alert from the CDC about the rising number of measles cases around the country.
So far this year, there have been 58 confirmed cases across 17 states. That's equal to the total number of cases we saw in all of last year.
3 of those cases we know were right here in Minnesota.
The Florida Department of Health has reported 10 measles cases, 9 in Broward County and 1 in Polk.
Most doctors agree the spread is being fueled by low vaccination rates, especially among young children, many of whom stopped getting the shots during the COVID outbreak and never got back on schedule.
The rate of immunization among kindergartners is starting to drop, and it's not surprising that this is the disease you see because this is the most contagious of the vaccine prevention.
Back in the time machine to August of 2014, that is when Bill Thompson made the admission that the CDC had lied and hid the fact that the MMR vaccine was associated with autism. Talking with Thompson as it unfolded felt like a spy movie. It led me to secretly record phone conversations with Dr. William Thompson, which I did in the state of Oregon because it's illegal to secretly record phone conversations in the state of California. Dr. Thompson freely admitted that he had covered it up, and his associates at the CDC had also covered it up.
Thimerosal causes autism-like features, and that's the way I would say it. I'm completely ashamed of what I did. The higher-ups wanted to do certain things, and I went along with it. Colleen is a center director, Frank is the director of immunization safety, and Marceline is the branch chief. They're still all much more senior than me.
Dr. Julie Gerberding was head of the CDC at the time. Coincidentally, she went on to a lucrative career at Merck, the manufacturer of the MMR vaccine.
I'm like, oh my God, I cannot believe we did what we did. But we did.
A blemish on the public health there. But now let's look at the current measles cases. Let's go right to the CDC because, again, we're being told this is an alert, this is an outbreak, we really should be scared. And so the CDC's own website, number of measles cases reported by week. This is from 2023 to current. And you can see there, it looks like there may be an issue. You know, we have cases going up a little bit.
Looks bad,
my gosh,
man.
all right.
Right.
You know, still 14 cases at the peak there in February. But now let's take this entire chart you're looking at and embed that in the last 20 years. And let's look what we're dealing with here. So there's the chart embedded there. There's that little blip on the right. That's the chart we just looked at. Now look at the rest since 2000. Not much is going on.
Right.
There's not much going on. So the current CDC numbers show 64 measles cases. That's the most recent they have. But I want to pivot here for a second, and I want to show the work that ICANN and the Highwire does on vaccines, on vaccine reporting, which is then used in real-time litigation to influence court cases. So portions of what I'm reporting here, or about to report here, was used in order to restore the religious exemption for Mississippi school children that we celebrated here at an ICANN newsletter. And so let's look at some of the documents here that were submitted by our attorneys to the judge in that case. And this is the first one here. This is the CDC Vital Statistics. This is a 1968 doc produced by the National Center for Health Statistics. And in here, it has a chart of the death rates for measles. Now, this is a really important chart. It tells an amazing story from 1900 to 1960. you have the death rate for measles per 100,000 population. You can see something there. By the way, the measles vaccine didn't come in and was licensed till 1963. So this is before the vaccine, before any shots went into an arm for measles. You see a what they call precipitous decline. And this is obviously, as we know, sanitation, better nutrition, improvements in all those areas. But
I want to look at that scale because it always looks really scary and like, oh my God, we really overcame something. But can we bring it back? Because I just, for the first time, really looked at that left column. And though it looks scary, you get the sense that there's like millions of people. Did you just say that this is basically per 100,000? So at the really extreme high there, we're talking about 13 people per 100,000. So though that, is alarming, I think that graph feels like millions when it's just really not. You're just talking about saying at the worst case scenario, this virus used to kill up to 13 people per 100,000, but by 1960 was down to just this side of zero.
Right.
All right.
And also to note,
before there was a vaccine,
measles,
right? Go ahead.
Yeah. Before the measles mass vaccination program was introduced, think about this, nearly everyone contracted measles and obtained lifetime immunity by about 15 years of age. So we know measles is a self-limiting childhood viral infection, and most of the cases are benign. They're not even reported to public health departments. So that's really, it's important to couch this conversation in. But now let's bring it to the vaccine, because as you saw from that report, of all the reporting of the current fear-mongering by the media, it's because of unvaccinated kids this is happening. Well, let's look at this vaccine. Let's look at the safety of this vaccine. So through Freedom of Information Act requests, ICANN has obtained the documents and the studies relied upon to license the MMR2 vaccine in 1978. This is what the FDA looked at. And so let's look at these clinical trials and let's look at how robust they were. So again, this was what they relied upon to vaccinate all children in the U.S., max vaccination program. 834 children vaccinated. That's how many they used.
That's the whole study. That's the size of the study.
That's the size of the study.
Yeah.
So you're obviously not statistically powered. You're going to miss a ton of rare issues. And so let's look at how long they followed these kids for safety issues. It says each child will be followed clinically for 42 days following vaccination. All local and systemic complaints will be recorded on the case report form. So day 43, something happens. We're not going to record that on the clinical form. And, people watching this, as you know, as a lot of people have woken up to during COVID, that the public is the final stage of safety testing. We need to pass the vaccine in order to see what's wrong with some
And let's
of the
be
issues
clear. I just want to point out, because we go through this and people, I know we can glaze over a little bit. 42 days was the length of the follow-up of this safety trial. There's almost not a drug that your grandparents take that would ever have a trial that short. So many of these trials are 6 years long. Let's see what the long-term health outcomes are. And we're talking about a product that is manipulating your immune system. So if there's going to be an issue, the most likely issue is an autoimmune dysfunction, that it throws the regulation of your immune system off. That's what it's designed to do. But what if it makes a permanent mistake? You're not going to see that in 42 days. You're going to see that about a year or two. We know that. And as we've pointed out, this is just another piece of evidence. We've never had a study of the childhood vaccines where we had a placebo group that went through, 2 to 6 years. They don't exist. This is just another one. 42 days. What do you expect to see if your immune system has been messed with by this product? There's no way to see it.
And fortunately, not all is lost, because as it rolls out to the public, after licensure, there is federal law that requires that the package insert for this vaccine, the MMR vaccine, it lists the adverse events. We'll take a look at this. So they have to, by federal law, list the adverse events for which there is some basis to believe there is a causal relationship between the vaccine and the occurrence of an adverse event. So let's look at what they have to list here. Looking at this, well, you see Guillain-Barré syndrome, you see transverse myelitis, you have pneumonia. I mean, you can go down there. They have
encephalitis, swelling in the brain. That's the big one right there when you think about that, because autism would be the result of your brain swelling as a child after getting this vaccine. I've said it before. A mother once came up to me and said, vaccines didn't cause my child's autism. It caused the brain swelling, the encephalopathy event that resulted in a symptom we now call autism. That is how people need to understand it. And there it is still still written right there in the package insert, meaning some people, some children are going to have this reaction from this product, but the government wants to tell us they don't matter, they don't count, let them die, let them be handicapped, let them have whatever issues they have. We're going full speed ahead, and we're never going to investigate that group, which is what Bernadine Healy so clearly put out. I was shocked to find there was not a single study that looked at the children that had been injured. That's a mind-blowing statement to make publicly.
Right, and there also has not been studies, as you know, about what children would be susceptible to these type of harms.
Right.
But that's beside the point at this point. So we have the Cochrane collaboration, a very well-respected institution, looking at the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine in children. They did a meta-analysis. It looked at 64 trials and studies involving just over 14 million children, and the authors concluded this. Quote, the design and reporting of safety outcomes in MMR vaccine studies, both pre and post-marketing, are largely inadequate. The evidence of adverse events following immunization with the MMR vaccine cannot be separated from its role in preventing the target.
This is not a scam. All Americans can apply for the 2024 $15,000 debt relief program.
Diseases. Even the CDC's own vaccine information statement that was on their website shows this when you look at it under MMR vaccines. They listed under the problem type, moderate, severe. You can see it under moderate, seizures, 1 in 3 every 3,000 doses, temporary pain and stiffness in joints, 1 out of 4 people. But then you go down to severe problems. It says serious neurologic reaction, less than 1 out of a million. Deafness, long-term seizures, coma, lower consciousness, permanent brain damage. That's actually on this vaccine information statement. And so obviously there's a lot of questions for a self-limiting childhood disease that's mostly benign.
Right.
Parents have this scale that they have to weigh when they see the media kind of over-exaggerating the fear reporting on this of just 64 cases in the entire United States.
Yeah.
This is what they have to look at too. And then we're going to finish this off with just putting everything in perspective. Physicians for Informed Consent, this is PIC, they have a measles mortality chart just to put it all in perspective. And they look at the death rate. This is measles mortality versus the leading causes of death in children under the age of 10 per 100,000. Now, interestingly, there's some nuance here. It's very important. They say pre-vaccine measles. So again, this was that chart we saw early on. They're choosing before the vaccine even came in, before all the sanitation was great, all of this stuff was happening. They said 0.9 per 100,000. Now, that's a small number compared to homicides, cancer, sudden infant death syndrome, SIDS there, unintentional injury, accidents, drownings, falls, congenital abnormalities or anomalies. And then at the bottom there, they have the MMR vaccine. And of course, it says insufficient data available, which is very, very astute by PIC to put this there. But that's really what we're dealing with as far as a danger continuum with this measles outbreak that's currently happening or one that may happen in the future.
Amazing reporting, Jeffrey. Just spectacular looking at just, the powerful women there. Dr. Eddy and, of course, Bernadine Healy and Mary Tyler Bowden. I mean, it's, and there's so many more we could talk about. But thank you for doing that great investigation. As always, I'll see you next week.
The MMR vaccine. So this is what you often hear. Everyone, did I do enough exclamation points on that one? Or thank you. Everyone will die without the MMR vaccine. Without the vaccine, everyone died. Well, let's take a look at the actual data. Okay, this is the numbers without the hyperbole. Measles vaccine, first licensed in 1963. 1963. There were approximately 400 deaths a year in each of the years prior to the licensure of the vaccine in 1963. In a time period in this country where there were still pockets of this country, like developing countries, where infectious diseases, including measles, were more dangerous, but still, 400 deaths. That was 1 in 500,000 Americans. This is mumps, first licensed 67, around 35 deaths a year on average. That's in the years prior, and this is rubella. 1969, about 15 deaths per year on average in the years prior. It's all available on the CDC, by the way. It used to be part of their pink book. Anybody familiar with the CDC's pink book? Okay, so that is their, they're on like the 14th or 15th edition or whatever. They're They're in some teen edition. And there was a table in there that included the number of deaths per year in the years before the vaccine was used. And we kept using it, and using it, and using it, and it's not in the pink book anymore. I don't know if it's because of us, but maybe. I don't know. But it's not there. But we have copies. So there you go. 440 deaths total from measles, mumps, and rubella on average every year in the years prior to vaccination. That's 1 in 450,000 Americans. Every death is a tragedy. We should care about every single person that dies from an infectious disease. We should care about every child injured by a vaccine as well. And we should also use rational, reasonable, calm, data-driven approach to making decisions, especially when it comes to individual and civil rights of parents, families, individuals in this country to decide the health care of their own children and themselves. Let's take a closer look. Let's go under the hood on measles on that number of 400, okay? This is an official chart from the CDC's, this was from the U.S. Public Health Service, a predecessor entity of the CDC, now part of the CDC. This chart was created in 1960-61. Before what? What didn't exist yet? Before measles vaccine. So when truth was original, when we didn't need to make graphs that make things look scary, here's what they showed you about measles. This is the measles mortality from an official United States government chart. The link is right below. You can go take a look at it. It's such a great resource. We use it all the time. I'm still waiting for that one to disappear. We have lots of copies. Disappear, it's fine. We have copies. You could see the mortality for measles went down over 98% from 1900 to 1960. Official federal government data. And when you click on this, not only do you see the chart, they also have the actual mortality table every year. So you could see the mortality rate by every 100,000 people. You can see the actual raw numbers.
The analgesic vitamin that eliminates 20 years of neuropathy pain.
Did you know that neuropathy pain has nothing to do with peripheral nerve wear or localized?
From 1900 all the way to 1960. Did the measles vaccine have anything to do with the decline in the measles mortality from 1900 to 1960 by over 98%? How do you know that? There's no measles vaccine. I actually had a debate with the doctor once. It took 2 times to get that. I think he had a few to drink, though, to his. So, yes, nothing to do with it. So what did it? What causes it to decline? Yeah, whatever that cacophony of sounds was, yes. Yes. Water, clean water, sanitation, right? I mean, there was most infectious disease and mortality went down precipitously from 1900 up into the 1950s, 60s. The only one paradoxically that went up was polio, by the way, but that's a different story. But every other one pretty much, diphtheria, I mean, there's the same chart for diphtheria, and not only in the US, but also in England and other developed countries, you had this massive decline, nothing to do with the measles vaccine. And like I said before, in 1963, when they came out with the measles vaccine, pockets of this country were still had the same conditions that cause an increase in mortality. So how much of that 400 deaths per year would have continued to decline without the existence of the measles vaccine? We'll never truly know, but you can't say none. I mean, even Dr. Ed, I deposed the pediatrician who trains pediatricians at Vanderbilt University in a case. It's on the Highwire website, and I have a lengthy exchange with her on exactly this point. Even she had to concede that probably some of it, at least some of that 400 was might have been due not to the measles vaccine. Okay, so the point is this, when parents are making medical decisions, certainly when government officials are making decisions on whether or not to strip you of your rights, ability to go to school, work, make choices about your own children's lives, medical decisions, they should do it based on an objective reality of the evidence. Yeah. Again, my grandparents died before my parents were born. Never thought about that before, actually. It's got me, I feel like I'm in the Matrix. Anyway, again, not to minimize any death, but you got to have an objective look at it. 28 people in the country every year, right now, die from lightning, according to CDC. 28. Just giving a little perspective. Would we have been there or even below that by now without the measles vaccine? To be sure, I just want to point something out. It's really important to understand about measles. Measles can be dangerous to little babies and to folks who are older who didn't get measles. And in the pre-vaccine era, they didn't get measles. In the vaccine era, it has had the unfortunate, unintended consequence of making it so that there are gaps in immunity and people do not get measles at the right time if they get measles. So it can maybe make it a little more dangerous. Just want to make sure I put that out there. So it has a paradoxical effect. And I don't know if there's a simple solution to that, but there it is. Reality is the reality. There are other unintended consequences of measles. First time I saw this study, I was actually dumbfounded. This is a prospective, not retrospective, meaning not looking backwards, which can always be manipulated. Forward-looking, they tracked over 100,000 people in Japan for over 20 years, and they looked at a whole host of variables. One of them was measles and mumps. For those who got it, did they die of cardiovascular disease, and if so, when? The amazing finding, incredible finding, is that those that had measles and mumps had a far higher lifetime survival ratio from cardiovascular disease. As you could see, these charts make them nice and clear. So you could see that this is the percent that survived, right? So this is 100%, 95%, 90%, 85%. Those who did not have measles and mumps, you could see right here, the black line. The green are those who had measles and mumps. A far greater percentage of them were still alive and did not die from cardiovascular disease. I didn't make the world or measles and mumps, so I can't tell you exactly why measles and mumps are protective, but it might be that for whatever reason, measles has been around for thousands of years, and human beings have developed an ecological relationship with this virus, maybe because it conferred a survival advantage. At least this study seems to indicate as much. Remember, cardiovascular disease is the #1 killer of Americans, 700,000 Americans every year right now, according to the CDC. If eliminating measles and mumps has caused an increase of a few thousand of or some number of those deaths, you're quickly eroding the benefit, even the purported benefit, even assuming all 400, assuming no other improvements in acute medical care, no other improvements in any pockets of the country, assuming the measles vaccine. The only way to stop those deaths would be the measles vaccine. This study alone reflects that we might have had a serious unintended consequence by deploying these products for a virus that was going out the door, that was quickly becoming less lethal, that was coming like scarlet fever, like other viruses and pathogens that they tried and over to make vaccines failed. Never were able to develop it. The pathogen eventually went out the door. You don't even hear about it today. If they had developed a vaccine for scarlet fever, you know what you'd be hearing today? We'd all be dead if we don't take the scarlet fever vaccine. Maybe. And you can just look here, by the way, for those who are, you could see there were statistically significant findings, right? You could see it doesn't cross the one line. So, for example, total cardiovascular disease, if you go across for, when you look at men, you could see a statistically significant reduction in cardiovascular disease, including after it was age-adjusted, including after it was adjusted by multivariable, including after adjusting for history of cardiovascular disease, also statistically significant reduction in total stroke, including after adjustments, and so forth. So this is a very, very robust study. that was done prospectively, and a finding that at that point is you can't whitewash it. It was there. The data was what it was. I've not found a single study that rebuts this. That's it. This is the only study out there that does this. And I don't think the CDC is putting this on their website anytime soon, by the way. Okay. And these are a bunch of other studies, none of which are as robust as that study of 100,000 prospectively. They're smaller, but what they each show, and everybody should take a chance to look at it, the International Agency for Research on Cancer found that those who never had measles had a 66% increased risk of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and a 233% increased risk of Hodgkin's lymphoma. Lymphomas killed 21,000 Americans in 2022. I don't know what percentage of them might have been caused by eliminating measles and mumps. And you can go through this increase of those who've had measles and mumps have 50% less. Measles have 50% less of ovarian cancer, and there's a bunch of other information over there in these studies. These studies kind of stand unrebutted in the literature. They happened back often in the 80s, 70s, when the diseases were, when it was a good time period to do these kinds of studies. They didn't really show what I would say the health authorities who want to promote vaccines would want them to show, and nobody's really followed up with them, but they're there. They exist. They didn't just disappear, kind of like unvaccinated kids. When you kick them out of school, they don't disappear from the state, by the way. They're still there. All right. So
He just broke the secrecy of the military treatment for tinnitus. It might sound crazy, but give me 60 seconds to explain. Everything you think you know about tinnitus is 100% wrong. Classified military...
Let's take a quick look at the safety of the MMR vaccine, and we'll move on. So the current MMR vaccine was licensed in 1978. It was not licensed against the original MMR vaccine, which was licensed in 1971, because it's a very different product, because it includes millions of pieces of aborted fetal cell and DNA debris in it. And it was based on 834 children, no control, and 40 days of safety review. You know what you can assess with that kind of study in terms of safety? Virtually nothing. A third of the kids, by the way, in some of these, of the 834, and they had a bunch of little smaller trials. About a third had gastrointestinal issues, and a third had respiratory issues. But apparently that wasn't a problem. If that wasn't a problem, I'm not sure why they bothered doing the study at all. But in any event, it's underpowered, meaning not enough people, didn't review safety long enough, and had no control. So it's pretty much a worthless study for safety. By early 1980s, there were only 3 routine vaccines in this country. That's it. DTP, OPV, and MMR. That was all. That was it. 3 routine vaccines. They were causing so much harm. So many people were suing and getting damages from the injuries that what happened? There was only one manufacturer left for each of those 3 products, and they went to Congress and they said, we're done. We're not making them anymore unless we have what? Immunity. So Congress, in their wisdom, said, planes, yeah, you can make those safer. Drugs, you can make those safer. Backhoes, farm equipment, chainsaws, all that stuff can be made safer. But childhood vaccines, the stuff you give to babies that we say is safe, okay, we'll give you immunity so you can keep selling your product that causes harms. We'll just make it so nobody can sue you. We won't make you make a better, safer product. You keep selling your defective, harmful product. We'll just make sure nobody can sue you, basically. And that's what Congress did. In 1986, they passed the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act of 1986. But not only did they give those manufacturers immunity for the 3 products that existed in 1986, they gave them immunity for all vaccines going forward. So we had 2 injected, 1 oral vaccine by 1986. We now have 17 vaccines on the childhood schedule. You might recall that everyone was dying in the early 80s. Who was here in the early 80s? Everyone was dying. And now we have 17 shots and everybody's saved. Again, I hate to be glib about it, but it helps put things into perspective, because the immediate reaction you often get from folks, but everybody's going to die. Oh, everybody wasn't dying in the early 1980s, and we only had 3 shots. But a lot of people were getting very injured by these shots, and they had to give them immunity for injuries. So one of the things about that 1986 Act is it required the CDC to create what's known as vaccine information statements by federal law, and it had to list what the CDC considered injuries that are caused by these products, okay? And they really tried hard to limit what they put on here. But this is the CDC's own vaccine information statement for the measles vaccine, MMR, and you can see it includes seizures, deafness, long-term seizures, lower consciousness, and brain damage. Not my words, CDC's words. And there's another thing about the safety of the MMR vaccine that people don't realize. When you have the package insert, you know, that piece of paper that comes with every drug, and there's a list of all of the post-marketing potential adverse events, everybody tells you, oh, they just put it in everything in there. They just put any injury in there, right? They just list all the injuries in the package insert. Everybody know what I'm talking about when I say package insert, right? A little piece of paper, and you get the drug. The vaccines have the same piece of paper. Section 6.2 will list the post-marketing adverse events. It's not a list of just any random issue. Here's what the federal law requires. It provides that the package insert for vaccine should include, quote, only those adverse events for which there is some basis to believe there's a causal, not correlation, causal relationship between the drug and the occurrence of the adverse event, end quote. That is the legal standard. You can't just put anything in a package insert. Case in point, here's the package insert for the Moderna vaccine, okay, for the COVID-19 vaccine. I could tell you in our 10-person vaccination practice, we're overwhelmed with COVID vaccine injury calls, submissions, form filling, emails, texts, you name it. These are the only things listed on the Moderna COVID vaccine package insert, right? They've got myocarditis and pericarditis, they couldn't avoid that one. Anaphylaxis, that's their giveaway. And syncope means fainting. That's it. That's what they list. No doubt the vaccine causes far more harms. Those are the ones that the evidence is to the point where they can't not include it. This is the MMR vaccine. This presentation will be available publicly. You can go look at it. A lot of these are very serious conditions. And they're not here because somebody at Merck thought it'd be fun to include them. 2022, we finally get a second MMR vaccine in the United States. Merck was the only one till 2022. GSK gets one licensed. GSK's vaccine gets compared, MMR vaccine, to Merck's MMR vaccine. What would they find? Here's the chart that shows it to you. Top left is the study that they published. That is the last table in the supplemental table of authorities that you have to click to different part of the page to get to. It wasn't in the actual primary study if you wanted to see the results. They buried it in the supplemental table. And when you go to the supplemental table number 6, what you will find is that serious adverse events, and when an SAE, a serious adverse events, means something very, very serious under the FDA definition. Death, disability. 2%, 2.1% that got the MMR vaccine made by GSK had a serious adverse event, and 1.92% that got Merck's MMR vaccine. But they did something. That alone, by the way, that's 1 in 50 kids. 1 in 50. Okay, that should be enough to go, whoa, we got a problem. We got a serious problem. But then they did something that you won't see in most clinical trials that have happened for decades. They actually created a new separate category where they separated out some of what would normally have been in the SAEs, and they put them in the new onset chronic disease, as if that's somehow better. I'm not sure why. NOCDs, so it's a new on a chronic disease, like the last thing you'd want, right? 3.4% of the GSK MMR vaccinated kids had a new onset chronic health condition, 3.7% of the MMR2. Remember, they don't enroll typically kids who are sick or unhealthy. They enroll healthy children. It's not normal in a 6-month period for 3.4% of healthy kids to get a new onset chronic condition and 2% to have a serious adverse event, and about 10% to have an adverse event that was prompted an ER visit. But understand, the way that it works for licensure is that as long as the experimental group, the GSK MMR vaccine, and the control group The Merck MMR vaccine have the same rate of harm. That means they are equally safe by the FDA standards. Safe by the FDA standards, not safe by any reasonable thinking, rational standard. Certainly not by the standard, I think, of most parents seeking to make good medical decisions for their children. All right, that's it. That's the 6 vaccines. I told you it'd be a little bit of a slog to get through it. I'll have some videos. I know.
Welcome to Full Measure. I'm Cheryl Atkinson. We begin today with an incredible story that spans 25 years so far. It involves the MMR vaccine against measles, mumps, and rubella given to most American babies in 2 doses. Yet you probably never heard about this controversy. It's brought to us by a scientist named Stephen Kraling, who worked on a project at Merck called Protocol 7 and was uniquely positioned to blow the whistle on what he learned. In the bigger sense, his account raises questions about what can go on unknown to most of us about products injected into nearly all children. Stephen Kraling was a published cancer researcher when vaccine maker Merck brought him on board as a virologist in 1999. That's when he says he found himself embroiled in an all-hands-on-deck corporate emergency.
So when I showed up to start work at Merck, they were dealing with a potential product recall, and it wasn't something that was just casually discussed. It was a sky is falling level event.
The crisis surrounded Merck's blockbuster-selling MMR vaccine against measles, mumps, and rubella, and worries that it might be defective.
It was the end of the world for them. I mean, can you imagine if they have to recall that? They have to go to the millions of parents whose kids got out-of-specification vaccine, let them know. They have to take the MMR vaccine off the shelves, and they didn't have a solution, so they would have had to stop selling it, stop distributing it.
To understand Kraling's part in this scandal, it helps to know something about how the vaccine is designed to work. So the MMR vaccine is one of the vaccines that contains live virus. Not all vaccines do, but this functions, if I'm stating it correctly, with some live virus in it that triggers an immune response or whatnot.
Yeah, all 3 viruses are live viruses.
And there's a limit on both ends of how much has to be in there, but no more than whatever for it to be safe and effective.
Yeah, and it's that upper limit, the maximum amount of virus, live virus that might be in it, has to be safe. And the lowest amount has to be efficacious. But within those parameters is where the product has to fall. So you can't have a lower amount of live virus, and you can't have a higher amount of live virus.
Though MMR was widely given in the 1970s, the 1980s saw measles, mumps, and rubella outbreaks among many vaccinated children and young adults. For example, in 1985, 69 measles cases at an Illinois high school with a 99.7% vaccination rate. Ultimately, the CDC recommended all children get a second dose of MMR. But the tricky part for Merck came in the mid-90s, when the FDA began a review of vaccines and found the potency of MMR wore off as it sat on shelves. So the FDA instructed Merck to start putting more virus into the vaccine up front. That's called overfilling, so it would stay potent for its 2-year shelf life. Merck started doing that in early 2000 and told us it's still doing that today.
So the problem was that these viruses degrade over time, and Merck had to calculate backwards and say, we need to add more virus so that this stuff doesn't degrade, because the FDA was adamant. You cannot keep distributing that vaccine if it's out of specification. They had to do this thing called an overfill, which is the same as if you take a glass of water and pour a lot into it till it overfills. They added more virus, vaccine virus, to the vaccine for measles, mumps, and rubella.
So that when it degraded over time on the shelf, it would still meet the lowest threshold it had to meet?
Exactly.
But what if someone got that vaccine 1 week into it being on the shelf before it degraded?
Well, you're getting a very high amount of vaccine virus.
If there's too much live virus in a shot, what are the sorts of problems that could occur? That's a potential safety risk?
Of course.
Internal documents suggest Merck was concerned that its vaccine was only potent for a year, according to court documents, but didn't tell the FDA. The FDA also slapped Merck with warnings for failing to report that it had put 23 million doses of MMR vaccine on the market that might not be potent when given. Merck risked losing its license to make the shots and future government contracts worth billions of dollars. But even with the overfilling, Kraling says the mumps virus was still dying off too fast. So Merck launched a key study known as Protocol 7. It aimed to show that the MMR vaccine still worked even with less mumps virus, so Merck wouldn't have to recall those millions of doses already out there. They had to prove that the lower amount of virus that people may have been getting or their children may have been getting, they had to try to prove that was effective.
Yeah.
Kraling was assigned to Protocol 7, but he says no matter what he and his fellow Merck scientists tried, they just couldn't make the vaccine with less mumps virus stand up to FDA standards. The big shocker came when Kraling says a Merck lab official started telling them to change the data to make it look better.
He says whenever you find this stuff, you have to cross them out and write in new numbers.
So wait, you haven't, so to be clear, falsifying documents.
Oh, absolutely. 100, like in the laziest way ever. I mean, just crossing it out. I mean, come on, who can get on board with that? So I was like, I'm not doing that. It wasn't so much just like some rogue whistleblower or two. It was a mutiny. There were 6 of us, and they just wouldn't do it. And if the boss came around and made them change data, like 2 of these interns from Villanova, they would just go and copy their original accounts and just hand them to me and say, he changed our data, here's the original copy. I'm like, all right, so we're collecting this.
Who reported this to the FDA?
It was me.
In 2001, Kraling notified the FDA that data was being destroyed and Merck was instituting a policy to fraudulently make the MMR vaccine look more effective. He was surprised when he heard nothing back from the FDA for weeks. While he was waiting, he got a meeting with a high-ranking Merck official who didn't yet know he'd already contacted the FDA once.
I mean, I told him I was going to call the FDA unless he could tell me what was going on here. I said, I want a scientific reason for what's going on. And he just said, it's a business decision. It's none of your concern. I was like, all right. And then when I left, the human resources guy was right outside the door telling me, you're going to jail. If you call the FDA, you're going to go to jail. And then the next day when I come in, the lab director got there early, and he was just taking all these viral plates, which the FDA should have the right to see, and he was just autoclaving them, destroying them. They were just destroying evidence. And then I'm like, all right, I got to call the FDA. Immediately call the FDA. Told them, get your effing asses in here, do your effing job.
As a result of Kraling's calls, the FDA did conduct an inspection. It confirmed that Merck's spreadsheets used to determine questionable results and retesting had not been validated, and raw data was being changed with no justification. To Kraling's surprise, none of that seemed to shake the FDA's confidence in Merck's ability to tell the truth about its vaccines. But he'd sealed his fate. He was removed from Protocol 7 and soon resigned. In 2010, Kraling and another former Merck scientist filed a whistleblower lawsuit against Merck. They alleged the company misled the CDC, the largest purchaser of vaccines, and defrauded taxpayers by omitting, concealing, and misrepresenting material information regarding its mumps vaccines. Dr. David Kessler, who headed up the FDA under Presidents Clinton and George W. Bush, served as an expert witness in support of the case against Merck. In 800 pages of testimony, Kessler repeatedly stated Merck and its MMR vaccine label had been misleading and the vaccine was adulterated, and he raised the question of whether MMR's lack of potency is to blame for mumps outbreaks among vaccinated people. The case took 14 long years and finally concluded last year. In the end, the court dismissed the case, stating CDC knew about allegations of fraud and potency, but bought the vaccine anyway, so there had been no fraud committed on taxpayers. Merck's misrepresentations as to potency and its Protocol 7 testing did not impact the CDC's decision to buy MMR vaccine, said the court. CDC was aware through its own studies that the vaccine proved less effective in the real world than in the clinical trials, yet CDC continued to purchase and recommend it. Therefore, government and taxpayers weren't defrauded. Merck wouldn't agree to an interview or answer questions, but told us Merck was transparent with FDA and acted appropriately at all times. Merck's MMR vaccine was appropriately labeled. Merck has disputed and continues to dispute the plaintiff's claims. And Merck worked with the FDA to assure that all of FDA's concerns had been addressed. Most significantly, Merck raised the potency of the MMR vaccine such that the potency was assured to be met throughout the shelf life. Meantime, mumps outbreaks have continued. For example, in 2020, the CDC said the vast majority of those infected in a 6-state outbreak were fully vaccinated. This raises concerns about waning immunity from childhood mumps immunization, concluded one analysis. Fortunately, mumps is typically mild, CDC says, and resolves within 2 weeks. Rare complications include deafness or encephalitis, a potentially fatal inflammation of the brain. Those are also, by the way, potential complications from the MMR vaccine. Today, Kraling says there's no way for parents or even doctors to know exactly how much live virus is really in Merck's MMR vaccine at the time it's given.
And so if you want informed consent, what should you be allowed to know? You should be allowed to know what's in it, how much is in it, and that those amounts and ingredients have been tested in a clinical trial and shown to be safe and effective. And for this one vaccine, nobody can say that's true. Maybe it's the greatest vaccine ever made. Maybe it's perfectly safe and effective. But if I ask you how much is in it and you can't tell me, that's a problem. I think it's a problem.
Merck says the MMR2 vaccine has been available for more than 50 years, and the importance of its place in public health can be seen with the decrease in the incidence of these childhood diseases. For more on this story, listen to my podcast, Full Measure, After Hours.
There were a lot of folks who were surprised to see RFK Jr.'s treatment in the Democrat Party. I mean, really, considering his last name was Kennedy, I think that's a valid shock. But when you consider the content of your book, all of the research that you put out there in your book, and his opinions on stopping chronic illness, staying off the pharmaceutical carousel, it's really not that surprising, is it?
It's not, and they've been after him for a good 20 years. He's been on this case through, in my evaluation, no personal benefit to his own self when he advocates for these causes, because he was certainly attacked and controversialized. He's been smeared. This is why the powerful interests in the Democrat Party don't like him. This is why they can't work with him or dare to let him be in there with them or with Donald Trump, because as he has said, he knows where the bodies are buried. He says on day one in office, if, for example, he'd been elected president or has the power, he knows exactly who to fire. He knows the names of the people at CDC that he believes are involved in corruption. He's a lawyer who has litigated vaccine injury cases and autism cases against the government and won them. He knows a lot, and they can't really afford to have him out there.
Your kids were young now. Would you give them the measles, the mumps vaccine?
No. I got measles, mumps when I was a kid. It was
lots of people used to die from those diseases.
Well, you know what? They died in the 1900s or early 1900s. There were about 10,000 Americans a year died. In 1964, there was about 300 or 400 who died, and they were almost all severely malnourished kids, mainly from the Mississippi Delta. This was before the poverty program, so there was a lot of starving children in our country. It's very, very hard to kill a healthy child with any infectious disease, but particularly with measles. And the World Health Organization now says vitamin A is an absolute cure for measles, which we didn't know about back then. Back then, we were treated with chicken soup, and it was, a week at home watching Leave It to Beaver, and every kid caught it. Every single kid got it. And I had 11 brothers and sisters, and we all got it, and we were all fine. And there are lots and lots of studies out there now that show that kids who get measles as a child are much healthier when they grow up, that they're much more resistant to cancers, to atopic diseases, to allergies, and to heart disease.
You went to Samoa. You convinced people not to get the measles vaccine. An outbreak resulted in 83 deaths.
Yeah, well, that story is not true. First of all, the Prime Minister of Samoa stayed the measles vaccine after measles vaccines killed a number of people in Samoa, including members of his family. So when I went to Samoa, the ban was already in place. And I visited people in Samoa. I didn't know there was no policy that resulted from my going to Samoa. Secondly, nobody died in Samoa from measles. They were dying from a bad vaccine. And the vaccine was imported from Australia and given to people who had measles, which is not recommended. The same measles outbreak hit Tonga, which is the neighboring island, and nobody died because they didn't get the vaccine. So this is more propaganda by the pharmaceutical industry, which is, drumming up a lie to try to discredit me. But if you actually look into it, John, you'll find that it is not true.
And you still say that autism is caused by vaccines?
Yeah, autism is caused by vaccines. And by the way, CDC's own data, they did a study called the Verstratton study in 1989. And they looked at the hepatitis B vaccine. They looked at children, and from the biggest database in the world, the Vaccine Safety Data Link, they looked at children who got the hepatitis B vaccine during their first 30 days, and they compared those to kids who got it later or didn't get it at all. And there was a 1,350% elevated risk for autism among the people who got the vaccine.
There may well be, but there are studies with millions of people. You ignore the big studies.
Look, you have this wrong. There's a series of about 13 studies that were done by people we call biostitutes. One of them was the leading one, who are people who do these studies for money for CDC. They were paid for by CDC in order to create the illusion that vaccines don't cause autism. The chief scientist was a guy called Paul Thornton, who CDC and his study is the most cited study for this proposition. And Paul Thornton is now a fugitive. He's wanted by Interpol. He stole millions of dollars from CDC that he had claimed to use on this study, but he was building houses, buying motorcycles, and living a life of luxury. And his study is absolute fraud. And yet they have not retracted it because CDC is a dishonest organization. It continues to be cited in the literature. And by the way, John, there are hundreds and hundreds of studies. I've written a book, if you're interested, called Thimerosal, Let the Science Speak, that has, I think, 1,400 references in it, over 400 studies cited that link autism and other related neurological injuries to vaccines. There is no question about it. If you actually read the literature, if you listen to what the propaganda that CDC tells you, yeah, vaccines don't cause autism, but it's propaganda. This is a captive agency that is intertwined and owned by the pharmaceutical industry.
The government scientists are acknowledging that even tiny infinitesimal amounts of mercury, parts per billion, will cause profound neurological injury in children. And I was working on these issues, and mothers started coming up to me and said, the biggest exposure is not coming from power plants or old mining claims, as you might think. It's coming from our own vaccines. And they asked me to work on it and just to look into it. And they were not hysterical people. They were scientists, they were doctors, they were psychiatrists, they were pharmacists, they were people who had their feet on the ground, they had attended the conferences, they had read the scientific literature, they had calmly and deliberately gone through this, and they had reached a conclusion. And the conclusion was that the vaccines were destroying the health, were making the sickest generation of American children in the history of our country. And I started looking into it, and somebody provided me with the with the Simpsonwood memo, which I then published in Rolling Stone. And Simpsonwood was the transcripts of a secret meeting that was held between CDC and 75 representatives of the vaccine industry, in which they reviewed a report that CDC had ordered, the Verstraeten study, of the 100,000 children in the United States Vaccine Safety Database. And when they looked at it themselves, they said it is impossible, this is a quote, to massage this data to make the signal go away. There is no denying that there is a connection between autism and thimerosal and the vaccines. And they said, and this is what they said, I didn't say this. This is what their own scientists and their own conclusion of the best doctors, the top people at CDC, the top people at the pharmaceutical industry. And you know, when they had this meeting, they had it not in Atlanta, which was the headquarters of the CDC, but in Simpsonwood at a private conference center, because they believed that that would make them able to insulate themselves from requests under the Freedom of Information Law, and they would not have to disclose the transcripts of these meetings to the public. Somebody transcribed the meetings, and we were able to get a hold of it. But you have them talking about the Verstraeten study and saying there's a clear link, not just with autism, but with a whole range of neurological disorders, speech delay, language delay, all kinds of learning disorders, ADD, hyperactivity disorder, and the injection of these vaccines. And they could tell because, as you know, the vaccine protocols were dramatically increased. When I was a little boy, we only got 3 vaccines. But my children, 5 of my 6 children, got 22 vaccines beginning in 1989. That's the thimerosal generation. That's the vaccine generation. And it's the sickest generation in the history of this country. And I looked at these, I read, and I was astonished, because I have worked on environmental issues for 25 years, and I know what captive agency phenomena is. It's the dynamic by which the regulatory agencies become captured by the industries they're supposed to regulate. And there's all kinds of mechanisms that encourage that or provoke that or promote that to happen. But I was shocked because I know many of these people in CDC, and I know the people in the FDA, and I know that when they entered those agencies, they entered it with a good heart, intending to do the right thing. But something had corrupted them. They got sucked into a vortex because they made decisions that were wrong, and then instead of admitting it to the public, they covered it up to protect themselves. And it was very clear, and then I got a hold of the correspondence between the doctors and between CDC, rebuking each other and saying, why didn't we look at this? Why didn't somebody do a mass loading before we did approve these protocols with 22 vaccines to these children? Why didn't we do this? Rebuking themselves, rebuking each other. And then the Simpsonwood transcripts, after the first maybe 2 hours in which they are talking about the undeniability of the connection between autism and thimerosal, the impossibility of massaging the data further in order to try to eliminate those signals. That's what they spend the first 2 hours. The rest of the meeting they spend talking about how do we hide this from the press, from the public, and what they call the predatory bar. All the lawyers out there who may represent people who were injured by their negligence. And at the end of that meeting, they make a few decisions. One is Verstraeten, the man who designed, who conducted the study, is hired the next day by GlaxoSmithKline and shipped off to Switzerland. And 6 months later, he sends in a redesigned study that includes cohorts that are predictably, who are too young to have been diagnosed as autistic. So he loads the study down, the data down, and they tell the public that they've lost all the original data. This is what CDC says to this day, that it does not know what happened to the original data in the Verstraeten study. And they published this other study it's a corrupt and crooked, what we call tobacco science, done by a bunch of biostitutes of crooked scientists who are trying to fool the American public. Then Kathleen Stratton from CDC and IOM says what we need is some studies that will disprove the link. So they work with the vaccine industry to gin up these 4 phony European studies that are done by vaccine industry employees, funded by the vaccine industry, and published in the American Academy of Pediatrics magazine, which receives 80% of its revenue from the vaccine industry. And none of these scientists disclose any of their myriad conflicts which conventional ethics rules require them to do. It's not disclosed. And these studies, and I've made a profession of reading phony science, of junk science, of tobacco science, because I see it every day. I've sued over 400 polluters, and this is how they defend themselves. They hire these phony scientists, tobacco scientists, they produce these phony reports, so I know how to read them. So I did something that not a single member, you see the press here and all there, not a single member of this press corps, I can guarantee you, has ever read any of those studies. It has not happened. What they read was the CDC's description of those studies, which has nothing to do with what's in the studies. And you need to read these studies, and I'm talking to you guys, and you need to read them critically. And that woman, I called that woman who wrote that Time magazine article. And I called the editor of the Washington Post when they said, this is the newest mythology. Well, they've removed the thimerosal from the vaccines and autism rates have not gone down. How many times have you read that repeated by these people from the press? That is an industry talking point that the industry knows is a lie. Everybody knows that's a lie. The amount of thimerosal today in the flu vaccines is about 60% of what they claim to have removed from all the other pediatric vaccines. I read these studies, and I saw studies that weren't even good for it. Wasn't even high-quality fraud. It is these are low-quality, the worst. I mean, you don't even need scientists to advise you and tell you where the fraud is. And I'll tell you what I'll just tell you one of them, the big one that they all rely on, the Danish study, where they said, okay, in 1992, Denmark banned thimerosal. And after that, autism rates continued to climb. Therefore, there is no association between autism and thimerosal. That's the study. What they didn't tell you is that in 1992, Denmark was concerned about the connection between thimerosal and autism and about this huge rise in autism, and it began for the first time registering autism as a reported illness in Denmark. So all the people who had autistic children suddenly had to register them for the first time. Plus, in Copenhagen, they founded a new clinic to treat autistic kids, which gave people a huge financial incentive and health incentive to register their children. So it was the registry that went up, not the incidence of autism that went up, but they didn't say that in the study. They never mentioned the Copenhagen clinic. They never mentioned the change in the rules in Denmark. They just show you the graphs of thimerosal is banned here and autism continues to go up. Well, the reason the autism rates rose was because it was an artifact of their data collection processes. It had nothing to do with the reality on the ground of the occurrence of autism. So, and you've heard all of their other studies, and they all have this guy, Paul Offit. You guys know him? And he is the poster child for the term biostitute. This is a man who has made himself the spokesperson for the vaccine industry. He portrays himself as an independent scientist. He doesn't disclose the millions of dollars that he does not disclose the millions of dollars of transactions. These people, one of the worst crimes that they've done. And I told the New York Times, I said, you guys had Judith Miller, for a year talking about the Iraq War and saying what a great thing it is and covering up all the truth from the government spokespeople. And I said, there's no difference what you're doing. And then you had to come out and apologize. And the Times publicly apologized for that. And I said, you're going to have to apologize for this someday, for what you've done here. Because what you've done here, that war is going to cost us $3 trillion. But the treatment of these children and the cost to our society from what you have done, what you are doing to this generation of children, is going to far exceed the cost of the Iraq war. And somebody is going to have to come to terms with that. And ultimately, the American press has completely let down our democracy. And one of the things you see repeated again and again is that the women, who claim that their children, and I've gotten now hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of letters, and that's not hyperbole, it's not exaggeration, from women who have the exact same experience. They bring a perfectly healthy 2-year-old who's exceeded all of their milestones to the doctor who they trust to get their pediatric flu shots, their MMR vaccines at the age of 2. They get that shot, the child goes into seizure, develops a fever that night, and over the next 3 months loses her or his ability to speak, to interact with his brothers and sisters, engages in stereotypical behavior, headbanging, screaming, biting, and loses all capacity for social interaction. And they lost this child, and they watch it happen. And it's happened thousands and thousands of times. And you hear that story once or twice, and you say, well, maybe it's an anomaly. But you hear it 100 times, and you have to say, we got to start looking at this. Nobody on the CDC has said, no, we're not going to look at it. We're going to cut off all funds to anybody who wants to look at it. Why isn't the press asking that question? Why aren't they asking CDC, why don't you study the Amish like UPI did? Why don't you study these homeschooled kids? 30,000 homeschooled kids studied by the UPI, and no autism in that group. They studied all the Amish in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. There should be 130 autistic kids. There's 4, and 3 of them were adopted after receiving their vaccines, and the 4th one lived downwind of a coal-burning power plant. So we know what the truth is, and what we've got to stop doing is blaming the mothers, which is what they've done. These are not hysterical women. These are people. I have a child who has allergies, profound allergies, life-threatening anaphylactic allergies, and asthma. My wife knows better than any doctor. She can put her hands on that boy, and she knows what's wrong with him. She knows if his chest is tightening up. She knows exactly what allergen triggered his allergy. She knows what's going wrong with that child. And these mothers know what made their child sick.